All right, welcome everybody. Welcome. This is the latest in a series of speakers from the Center for Race, Rights, and National Security discussing Islamophobia. We are very proud of the work of the center and very proud that it's part of, I think, the law school's longstanding tradition on social justice issues. Without further ado, what I would like to do is I'd like to introduce one of our fellows at the center, Zara Mian, and she's going to talk a little bit more about today's program and our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights for the latest installment of our Islamophobia lecture series. We're pleased to welcome our guest speaker to this event, Dr. Nazia Kazi. Dr. Kazi earned her Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Northwestern University, followed by a Master's in Social Welfare at Columbia University, and her PhD in Cultural Anthropology at the City University in New York Graduate Center. Professor Kazi teaches courses at Stockton University in New Jersey on race, ethnicity, immigration, and Islam in the United States. Her work explores the role of Islamophobia and racism in the context of global politics. Professor Kazi is the author of many publications, including Thomas Jefferson Owned the Quran, Cultural Citizenship, Muslim American Representational Politics and Voting to Belong, The Inevitability of Systemic Islamophobia, and Teaching Against Islamophobia in the Age of Terror. She has lectured widely on Islamophobia, including her TED Talk, Islamophobia and Islamophilia. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Nazia Kazi and present her with this token of our gratitude.
Thank you so much, Zara, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to Professor Sahar Aziz for making this event possible. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here. So it has become a well-known fact that the United States is the world's biggest incarcerator. Books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and documentary films like Ava DuVernay's 14th have pointed to the undeniable fact of mass incarceration and its racialized dimensions. The US is also an undeniable empire, its military budget towering over that of the next 7 largest militaries combined. The US military bases exist in all corners of the world, sparking sustained protest from locals who oppose them. And several territories are explicit colonies of the US, where residents serve in the US Armed Forces in spite of not having legal citizenship, voting rights, or even access to the veteran services they so direly need. So you have, on the one hand, this system of racist mass incarceration, and on the other, this expansive system of imperialism. So at the middle of these, at the intersection of these two, we have what is called carceral imperialism. Carceral imperialism, the use of mass incarceration, policing, surveillance, often abroad, for the very purposes of protecting the interests of America's ruling elite on a global stage. The detention center at Guantanamo Bay, built by a corporation called Halliburton, with a former CEO named Dick Cheney, cost $10 million to build, and it stands as America's Muslims-only prison, housing hundreds of inmates, many on secret evidence, many cleared for release after being found not guilty and being held regardless. Guantanamo is a quintessential embodiment of carceral imperialism. Now, the fact that the detention center is in Cuba, away from easy view of American activists and watchdogs and journalists, that is crucial. So is the fact that Cuba itself has been a pawn in America's foreign policy machinations, with the US attempting dozens of assassinations of its political leaders, imposing a devastating blockade, and carrying out a regime change operation. I would like to suggest that we can learn something crucial about Islamophobia through the simultaneous lenses of America's signature system of mass incarceration and the system of U.S. empire building. It would be fruitful to let this question guide our conversations about Islamophobia. What happens when the world's greatest carceral state is also the world's leading imperialist force? What Guantanamo tells us is that imperialism has a necessary habit. It attempts to outsource its own brutality. This is the raw material for maintaining a thin veneer of American exceptionalism. Naomi Klein has written vividly about a Dr. Ewan Cameron in her book, The Shock Doctrine. Dr. Cameron, the Canadian doctor who received ample CIA funding, was conducting bizarre and traumatizing psychological experiments on his patients. The results of these illegal and unethical experiments would help the CIA in its psychological operations around the world. But of course, the US could have found a torture doctor here on US soil. Why go all the way to Canada? Why go all the way to Cuba to build this detention center? Why go all the way to Somalia to build CIA black sites, which are off-the-grid detention and interrogation facilities? Why must U.S. empire take such great care to mask its most egregious elements? Writes Mahmoud Mamdani, by the beginning of the 20th century, it was a European habit to distinguish between the rules of civilized wars and colonial wars. Bombing originated as a method of war that was only to be used against uncivilized adversaries. The first bomb ever dropped from an airplane was an Italian bomb exploded in North Africa. The first systematic aerial bombing was carried out by the British Royal Air Force against the Somalis. Now today, the US is a pro at this kind of compartmentalization. We might think about the way people were talking a few months ago about the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. The Saudi Arabian journalist who was cut into pieces by, it seems, the orders of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So on the one hand, you have Trump and his camp, the people who are saying our business deals with Saudi Arabia are far too precious to jeopardize by holding them accountable. And on the other hand, you have the resistance, I don't know, who say we need to cut ties with Saudi Arabia for their heinous acts. And this is it. This is the spectrum of public conversation on the issue. How will the US deal with their, Saudi Arabia's, barbaric acts? But what I think is interesting is how that very conversation is framed. How are we, here in the US, to deal with them, the barbaric Saudis, as though they're some monstrous entity on their own? But for anyone who's read history, it is this, that the US created Saudi Arabia by design to be a brutal regime, to be anti-democratic. And yes, Democrats and Republicans alike have signed off on this alliance. There is no Saudi royal family. Indeed, there is no Saudi kingdom, nor is there the kingdom's brutality without the necessary hand of the US. So, as oil became increasingly profitable a century ago, the US and Britain eagerly identified key players across the Middle East who would help them secure access to it. On the Arabian Peninsula, this was a warlord named Ibn Saud. He had risen to power by allying himself with the ultra-conservative and pretty obscure Wahhabi Muslim movement. Now, the US saw that repressive, extremist religiosity would help guarantee American control over the region. So Chevron, yes, the very Chevron whose ads inexplicably show up when you're scrolling Instagram, helped Ibn Saud cement his alliance with the Wahhabis and establish his kingdom. But Ibn Saud was unpopular, deeply unpopular with the people. And to help him in the face of this resistance, the US built a military base in Saudi Arabia. At this base, it trained Saudi officials to torture and kill protesters. Timothy Mitchell describes how repression in the Arabian Peninsula was the raw material for America's economic prosperity. In 1956, when Saudi oil workers went on strike demanding that the US close its military base there, The US saw to it that these dissenters were tortured and then deported. In the 1970s, when protesters occupied holy sites demanding an end to the corruption and repression of the Saudi royal family, US-backed Saudi troops killed them. So how can the US talk about distancing themselves from Saudi brutality? The Arabian Peninsula has been a laboratory for American brutality. It seems you can't spell Saudi without USA. Today, I'm going to read a few sections of my book with you. It's called Islamophobia, Race, and Global Politics. So just a few notes on that before I do. This is a very introductory book. I teach undergraduates at Stockton University in New Jersey, specifically a class called Race and Islam in the US. And there are a lot of really phenomenal texts out there that connect Islamophobia to American empire building, and that connect Islamophobia to white supremacy. But oftentimes, a lot of these texts are very alienating to the types of students who find themselves in our undergraduate classes. Students who are victims of, shall we say, the no child left behind model of education. In other words, the academic texts that exist on Islamophobia don't make any sense to the students I teach. So this book was largely meant to be a sort of jargon-free, introductory text on Islamophobia. But there's another problem, which is that a lot of the public conversation on Islamophobia focuses on like knowing Muslims. Like maybe if you take an intro to Islam class and learn what the 5 pillars are, then Islamophobia will vanish. But that's not where Islamophobia comes from. And what I try to argue in this book and in a lot of my work is that Islamophobia is about the politics of US empire building and a long-standing project of white supremacy. And there's no amount of hijab solidarity days or interfaith Ramadan dinners that will begin to fight Islamophobia. This is about fighting a violent project of empire building. So my task and my challenge in writing this book was doing that in a way a 19-year-old student who finds themselves in one of my classes might be able to digest and find provocative enough to provoke them to do further reading. So, with that in mind, I will read a few selections. This chapter is called Culture Talk as Islamo-Diversion. Terrorism experts have spilled much ink on why certain people commit acts of extremist violence. Some of the factors they point to include the person's relationship to his father and mother, exposure to orthodox religious teachings, a childhood in a remote village, even sexual frustration and testosterone levels. For plenty of terrorism experts, the obvious way to understand and prevent terrorism is to understand an individual's psychology, cultural background, or religious practices. This culture talk, as Mahmoud Mamdani calls it, means that people investigate Islam and Muslim culture as the source of the problem of terrorism, actively ignoring the political realities that give rise to it. Terrorism experts are eager to locate the causes of terrorism within a particular flawed individual or his cultural norms, rather than in larger social systems and political histories. I laughed out loud when I learned that serious military experts thought Saddam Hussein's desire for a nuclear weapon may have stemmed from his treatment by his stepfather. I guess America must have had a pretty mean stepfather then. After 9/11, Columbia University professor Laila Abu-Lughod was approached by several media outlets who asked questions like, do Muslim women believe X? Are Muslim women Y? And we ought to ask ourselves, why was it that she was asked about the significance of the burqa in Afghanistan, but not about the long history of the United States arming and training those forces in Afghanistan, who would later be deemed terrorists? Instead of political and historical explanations, Abu-Lughod says, experts were being asked to give religio-cultural ones. Of course, many ordinary Muslims, too, feel that if people understand their cultures and customs, it will diminish anti-Muslim sentiment. Earnest university students, in an attempt to shift their colleagues' perceptions of Islam, host hijab days, in which they invite non-Muslim women to try on a headscarf. Many believe this simple act will summon greater understanding of the Muslim experience. It is in this spirit that Muslims across the country host interfaith dialogues, panels whose speakers might include a rabbi, an imam, and a priest. Again, such events give Muslims an opportunity to explain themselves, to explain their religious practices or their culture, and each offers the broader public a chance to know Islam. Each assumes that Muslims in the West can solve their problems by focusing on attitudes, knowledge, and ideology rather than on political ideologies. But what happens when we choose to engage in a dialogue about culture instead of about politics? What happens when we try to understand each other's religions rather than understanding our histories? And I'd like to suggest that there's a deep trade-off, a sacrifice that is made when we engage in this culture talk. I asked my audience at a workshop I was teaching, how many of you have heard the phrase, Islam is a religion of peace? Everyone's hand went up. It seemed that the Muslim PR machine had spread that one-liner far and wide. Then I asked, how many of you know about the kill list established under the Obama presidency? This was a list that granted the president powers to assassinate people, even US citizens, without judicial process. Of course, it predominantly targeted Muslims. Legal scholars have warned that the kill list signifies a huge overreach of executive power. And when I asked that, not one hand went up. Similarly, many of my undergrads know that Ramadan is a holy month in which observant Muslims fast, but very few know about the material support the United States provides for the Saudi Arabian war that has devastated the country of Yemen. Yemen is today suffering the world's largest cholera outbreak as a result. And then another couple sections from a chapter called U.S. Empire's Muslim Cheerleaders. In a show of defiance, one of the main speakers at the 2016 Democratic National Convention was a man named Khizr Khan. Khan, a Muslim man whose son had died fighting in the U.S. war in Iraq, took the podium and delivered what was arguably the climactic address of the DNC with an outright challenge to Donald Trump. Raucous applause followed, and Khan became the star of the DNC. His speech that night embodied a quintessential patriotism, reminding the audience of a son perished in war, brandishing a copy of the Constitution as an affront to Trump. He was the Democratic Party's archetype of a model Muslim. Now, we've spoken in this book of markers of legitimacy that Muslims use, markers such as class, profession, educational status. That July evening, Khan's speech positioned the loss of his son in a U.S. war as a marker of legitimacy for the American Muslim, issuing a reminder that Muslims, too, serve in the U.S. war machine. This might explain the roaring applause. Service in the Iraq War has become another marker of legitimacy. Support for the armed forces and their military incursions is a baseline credential for Muslims to prove their worth. Think, for instance, about how Republican Senator John McCain opposed Trump's travel ban because it would impact those Iraqis that had helped the U.S. in its war effort. The feeling that Muslims ought not to be discriminated against because of their support for American warfare has a long history. In 2008, former Secretary of State Colin Powell appeared on Meet the Press, and he condemned the Islamophobia that many Republicans were using to smear candidate Barack Obama as Muslim and therefore un-American. He spoke of a photograph he saw in a magazine, a photo about troops who were serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he talks about how he visits a cemetery and sees the gravesite of a slain Muslim soldier. For Powell, this Muslim man's death in an American war was enough to make him American through and through. Well, let's consider what it means to stand in support of the U.S. war machine as a marker of legitimacy. Well, let's take what began in 2003 in Iraq as an example. Of course, even though neither Saddam Hussein nor any Iraqis had anything to do with 9/11, as a predominantly Muslim and Arab country, Iraq was nebulously, somehow, guilty of 9/11. I was a college student in 2003 and had only recently become immersed in studying the politics and history of U.S. Middle East relations. I saw my peers expressing support for the war in ways that confused and troubled me. I remember sitting in a dorm room with friends, stunned, as I heard a neighbor say, "What, do you think any country would let 9/11 happen to it and not need to go to war with someone?" For him, as for countless Americans, the facts didn't really matter. It was enough to declare war on them, and they were Muslim and Arab enough to deserve it. In fact, the whole war effort relied on such slippages. Some supported the war because it would offer the United States a chance to carry out regime change and dethrone Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator. It didn't matter to them that the United States supports dictators aplenty, nor that the United States was a prime reason Hussein had climbed to power to begin with. Others felt the war was justified because Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Interesting, given that the United States had helped Iraq develop its chemicals weapons arsenal during its war with Iran in the 1980s. Nor did it matter that Hussein had condemned al-Qaeda and Islamist terrorism, or that he had offered to help the United States fight violent religious extremism. What did matter for the countless Americans who supported the war was that Iraq is Arab, Muslim, and as it was dubbed by George W. Bush, part of an axis of evil. Okay, another section from that same chapter. This is a section called What Good Muslims Do. In recent times, if the U.S.-led war against terror is to hold water, is to be seen as valid, then intolerance and bigotry must be seen as their problem, not ours. The enemies are the ones who are intolerant. The enemies are the ones who are parochial. The enemies are the ones who are narrow-minded, not us. On the contrary, the United States must prove itself inclusive of its multiracial and multi-ethnic body. This is a large part of why the figure of the good Muslim is so critical. Their inclusion is part of the legitimizing rationale for U.S. empire. There are commentators from Muslim backgrounds who have made their whole careers by simultaneously cheerleading for U.S. imperialism and condemning Muslims' backwardness. For instance, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Irshad Manji, and Fareed Zakaria. Marking certain Muslims good is certainly not a new tactic, and I would urge everyone to read Mamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, if you haven't already. Yet, it has taken on a new significance since 9/11, and even more so during the Trump presidency. Declaring that Islam is a religion of peace or that Muslims condemn terror leaves out a big part of the story. Writes Deepa Kumar, Rutgers' own, liberal Islamophobia acknowledges that there are good Muslims, those who cooperate with the goals of empire. Arun Kundnani agrees in his book, The Muslims Are Coming, telling us the liberal caveat is that Muslims are acceptable when depoliticized. They should be silent about politics, particularly U.S. foreign policy and the domestic national security system. They should not embrace an alien ideology that removes them from the liberal norm. So through images of Muslims waving American flags, offering up their children as tribute to the war machine, or signing up as eager supporters of the fight against terrorism, the West can then celebrate, incorporate, or tolerate certain Muslims without ever drawing into question its own imperialist project. Consider a billboard that appeared on the side of a major highway near Chicago. It read, "Hey ISIS, you suck," from American Muslims. Now, I doubt the billboard was actually addressed to ISIS, unless there's a covert ISIS cell off I-90. Instead, it was a defensive act. The billboard was a message directed to white Americans by Muslims who are often unfairly asked to condemn terrorism, as if that's their condemnation to make. But condemning ISIS is ostensibly much safer than condemning U.S. foreign policy. Perhaps for good reason. Corey Robin reminds us that throughout history, migrants who voiced strong opinions on questions of foreign policy or politics have attracted unwanted attention to themselves. As we saw in Chapter 5, without fail, Muslim sermons, panel discussions, and community events have included a condemnation of ISIS, terrorism, or violence against civilians. I even attended an Eid sermon in Chicago in which the Khatib delivered a speech devoted entirely to condemning the horrors committed by ISIS. I was saddened to see these hundreds of Muslim congregants gathered to celebrate one of the biggest holidays, subjected to a lecture condemning the group with which they have no connection. In fact, Muslims across the West have led, organized, and filled the streets in marches against terrorism, for instance, in Germany and Spain in 2017. In other words, Muslims have condemned terror. But there's a slippery slope here. There's a slippery slope between condemning terrorism and being an implicit advocate for the U.S. war on terror. After all, the latter means implicit support for war efforts, such as the ones in Afghanistan, the longest U.S. war, and Iraq. It also means supporting the domestic processes of surveillance and policing of Muslim communities. Consider the CVE program, which saw many Muslims themselves, including imams, social workers, and teachers, assisting the state in its surveillance and policing of Muslims. As Sahar Aziz has said, CVE became a guise for deputizing well-intentioned Muslim leaders to gather intelligence on their constituents that places their civil liberties at risk. So in trying to prove oneself a good Muslim, one must essentially be willing to participate in Islamophobia. But Islamophobia will not be defeated by recruiting certain Muslims to carry out racialized, ineffective policing of their own communities. Nor will terrorism be defeated by sending Muslim American soldiers out to fight and die in wars of aggression in Muslim-majority countries. The goal of a principled anti-racism is never to incorporate minorities into an existing power structure. Asking to be integrated into the top of a racial hierarchy doesn't dismantle the hierarchy. It leaves it intact. Principled anti-racism means seeking to abolish the very roots of imperialism and racism. Otherwise, we'll just be satisfied when arms dealers like Lockheed Martin set up Friday prayer spaces for their employees. But there is a vast difference between pointing to Muslims who serve faithfully in the U.S. military and pointing to the transgressions of the military itself. For a society that is so shamefully accustomed to racism and militarism, these critiques are far harder to make. Now, if we're not careful, U.S. empire will have us celebrating the inclusion of all races, gender identities, and religions into its sinister project of empire. So those are some selections from the book. Again, as you can see, what I'm trying to do is draw some critical connections between Islamophobia and domestic race politics, right? And foreign policy, and hopefully in a way that is intelligible to even sort of an introductory reader. Hopefully we have time for maybe some discussion and question answer. I can hear from all of you, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Professor Kazi. We're really honored to have you here, and this book is a very exciting book, and I have the privilege of the semester of teaching undergrads as well, so I may have to assign that for the students that are here today. But what you've done is somewhat radical, based on the way that we're normally taught, in the diversity rhetoric that we're exposed to in schools and the kumbaya slogans that we have. And where does that leave American students and the average American who has good intentions in terms of wanting to stop discrimination, stop Islamophobia?